Right. So welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're going to get into something I think pretty complex happening in Germany, and that's the connection between mental health and crime.
Okay.
And kind of guiding us through all of this is an article that we've got some excerpts from a German article. It's called How Crimes and Mental Illnesses Are Connected.
Interesting.
Yeah. And the reason I wanted to dive into this is that, you look at the crime rates in Germany and they're actually going down overall.
Yeah.
Which is great.
Right.
But at the same time, the number of crimes committed by people who might be struggling with mental health, maybe struggling with mental illness, that's actually on the rise.
Yeah.
So it's kind of this unsettling trend, and I wanted to understand, what's going on here.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, that's the $1 million question that everyone's trying to figure out. It's causing a lot of debate in Germany right now.
Well, let's get into some specifics from this article.
Yeah.
And they highlight a number of recent incidents that have really kind of shaken people up in Germany. You've got the attack on that Christmas market in Magdeburg.
Yeah.
The stabbings in that park in Aschaffenburg, car attacks in Munich and Mannheim. It's enough to make anyone anxious, what is going on?
Yeah. It's, those high-profile cases, those are really just the tip of the iceberg, right?
Yeah.
When you look at the overall numbers, and I was looking at the article cites data from the German Society for Psychiatry and Psychotherapy.
Wow.
They're seeing a significant rise, across the board in Germany, in the number of what they're calling mentally ill offenders.
Okay, so before we go any further, though, I think it's important for us to kind of set the stage a little bit here and make sure we understand the legal context in Germany, because this is a little different maybe than other places.
Yeah.
And the article mentions this concept called Schuldunfähigkeit, which, basically means inability to be held culpable.
Right.
So if someone is judged not responsible for their actions because of a mental illness,
Yeah.
They're treated differently in the legal system.
Exactly. Yeah.
So instead of going to prison, they might end up in a psychiatric facility.
Yeah.
So, this legal concept, it's always been there in Germany, but it sounds like what's changing now is the sheer volume.
Yeah. I mean, it's like the numbers are really, really startling when you look at them. And they use Hamburg as an example.
Okay.
They said that the number of people categorized as mentally ill offenders in the last 25 years, it's skyrocketed, or it's increased fivefold.
Fivefold. That is huge. Okay, so that's got to be putting an enormous strain on the entire system.
Oh, absolutely. Think about it. And the article kind of goes into the consequences of this. Overcrowding in these forensic psychiatric facilities is a massive issue. They use Ochsensaal Clinic in Hamburg as an example. Wow.
And it paints a pretty grim picture. I mean, when you have too many patients, not enough staff, the quality of care is going to suffer.
Okay, so we've kind of got this perfect storm brewing, right? We've got more people being categorized as mentally ill offenders. We've got overcrowded facilities, and then this concern about whether people are getting the treatment, the right treatment that they need.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder, why is this happening, right? Is it that these folks are simply falling through the cracks of the mental health system?
I think it's more nuanced than that. The article, they talked to this professor, Jürgen Miller. He's a professor of forensic psychiatry.
Okay.
And he says it's not quite that straightforward.
Right.
You have some people who struggle to get the help that they need. They might not have access to it.
Yeah.
But then there's this other group of people who actually could have access to treatment, but they choose not to take it.
Right. They might stop taking their medication or end therapy too early.
Yeah.
And sadly, this can lead to situations where they might end up committing crimes while they're in this unstable state.
Right. Yeah. It's almost like a catch-22 because you can't force someone into treatment unless they're a danger to themselves or others. But so often it seems like they only get help after something terrible has happened.
Exactly. And to make it even more complicated, the article quotes another expert, Hans Ludwig Prober.
Okay.
He's also a professor of forensic psychiatry, and he points out that courts are increasingly kind of opting for what they see as the safest route, which is placing people in psychiatric facilities instead of prison.
Oh, okay.
Even if their crimes aren't that serious.
Wow.
And sometimes indefinitely.
Wow. So if I'm hearing all this correctly, we've got this situation where people who might benefit from mental health care aren't always getting it. And then when they do end up in the system, it's often under these really, difficult circumstances. It's a lot to unpack, and it feels like we're just scratching the surface here.
I think so, yeah. And it's important to remember, though, that the goal of forensic psychiatric care in Germany is twofold. They have this phrase Besserung und Sicherung,
Okay.
which means improvement and security, and it's ideally in that order: improvement and then security.
Right.
So the challenge is, how do you achieve that? How do you achieve that in a system that is under so much pressure? That's
the question, right? And I'm guessing the answer is not an easy one. I do want to get into kind of what all of this means for the people who are in these facilities. Like what does treatment actually look like in these overcrowded, understaffed environments? And how do you even measure success? Is it about just preventing people from reoffending, or is it something more than that?
Yeah, no, those are really good questions. I mean, I think to really get into that, we need to hear from, someone who's been on the front lines of this issue, someone who's worked within this system and can really talk about the challenges and the insights that they've gained.
Absolutely. Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about just all these pressures, facing the forensic psychiatric system in Germany. And, the interesting thing about this article that we're looking at, it includes some pretty stark firsthand accounts, like from, people who have worked in these facilities.
Yeah. One that really stood out to me was Sven Reiners. He's a former head of a forensic psychiatric hospital in Berlin, and he doesn't really hold back in his criticism of the current situation.
So what kind of picture does he paint? What are his main concerns?
Well, he describes a system that's just completely overwhelmed. Imagine this. You're responsible for the care of some of the most vulnerable people in society, people who, might be a danger to themselves or others, but you're constantly short-staffed. You're, dealing with more patients than you can handle, and there's this immense pressure to keep everyone safe. And it's a recipe for burnout for both the staff and the patients.
It's interesting because earlier we were talking about that legal concept, the Schuldenfähigkeit, the idea that some people can't be held responsible for their actions because of mental illness. But then when you hear, like, Reiners describe the conditions in these facilities, it makes you wonder, are we really doing these individuals any favors by placing them in these overcrowded, under-resourced environments?
Right. I think that's a really important question, and it's something that's been raised by human rights organizations as well. The article actually mentions the National Agency for the Prevention of Torture. Huh. They've issued reports highlighting some pretty disturbing conditions in some of these facilities. Things like prolonged isolation, limited access to fresh air and exercise, inadequate mental health care, and they point to overcrowding as a major contributing factor.
So it's almost this vicious cycle, right? You've got more people entering the system, which leads to overcrowding, which then leads to this deterioration in the quality of care, which could then potentially make it even harder for people to recover and to reintegrate into society.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's definitely a complex situation, but and I do think it's important to remember that the staff who work in these facilities are often, they're doing their best under some really challenging circumstances.
Yeah.
But Reiners really argues that the system itself is setting everyone up for failure.
So does he offer any solutions? What does he propose instead?
Well, one of his biggest criticisms is that he thinks there's an over-reliance on medication as a primary treatment method.
Okay.
He argues that it's often used as a quick fix, just to manage symptoms without actually addressing the underlying causes of behavior. And he says that this comes at the expense of therapy, which he sees as being, crucial for long-term rehabilitation.
So it's not just about, giving people medication to make them compliant. It's about actually helping them understand their condition, develop coping mechanisms, and ultimately, kind of take control of their lives.
Yeah.
But I mean, is that even realistic in a system that's so stretched thin already?
Well, Reiners acknowledges that it is a huge challenge, but he argues that we need to shift our focus from, simply containing people to actually treating them.
Okay.
And that means investing in more therapists, reducing caseloads, and really creating an environment where people feel safe and supported.
I'm curious, does he address the issue of recidivism? Like, is there any evidence that this more, therapeutic approach actually does lead to lower rates of reoffending?
He does. He points to studies that have shown that individuals who do receive adequate treatment, especially therapy, they're significantly less likely to reoffend. And in fact, the article it cites a statistic that was really pretty striking. The recidivism rate for those who receive proper treatment, it's around 14% compared to, get this, 70% for the general offender population.
Wow, those numbers are pretty compelling.
Yeah.
But I mean, if therapy is so effective, why aren't we seeing those lower recidivism rates across the board? Is it simply a matter of resources, or are there other factors at play?
Yeah, I think resources are definitely part of it. But Reiners, he's particularly concerned about the way that we're treating substance abuse within the system.
Right.
He argues that we're not doing enough to address the underlying addiction, and that we're too quick to release people back into the same environments that contributed to their problems in the first place. And he's got a point. I mean, the article mentions that individuals with substance abuse issues are actually among the most likely to reoffend.
It's kind of heartbreaking to think that someone could go through all that treatment, make progress, and then end up right back where they started because they lack the support in the outside world.
Yeah, and it's not just a personal tragedy; it's a societal failure.
Yeah.
Reiners argues that by not adequately addressing addiction, we're essentially guaranteeing that these individuals are just going to cycle in and out of the system. It's costing taxpayers money and putting everyone at risk.
I can see why he's so critical of the current approach, but I also wonder, is he being too idealistic?
Mm-hmm.
Like, even with the best intentions, can we really expect to completely solve the problem of recidivism?
Well, I think Reiners, he's not naive to the challenges, right? But he believes that real change is possible, but it requires a fundamental shift in our thinking. We need to move away from this idea that punishment is the primary solution,
Right.
and start investing in prevention, in early intervention, in community-based support systems.
It's a pretty radical departure from the way we've traditionally approached criminal justice, but I can see how it could potentially lead to better outcomes, both for individuals and for society as a whole. But let's be honest. I mean, there are a lot of people who are going to be very resistant to this kind of change.
Oh, absolutely. Anytime you challenge the status quo, you're going to encounter resistance. But I think what's important is that we start having these conversations. We start questioning our assumptions, and we're open to exploring new ways of doing things.
We've talked a lot about the challenges within this system. But what about the public perception of all this? I mean, you mentioned those high-profile cases at the beginning, the ones that really grab the headlines and kind of fuel people's fears.
Right.
How does that play into this whole conversation?
Yeah, I think that's a really crucial piece of the puzzle, and the article does address this issue of public perception.
Well, let's unpack that. Let's unpack that after the break. We'll be right back. So we're back, and before the break, we were talking about how public perception plays into this whole issue of mental health and crime. And it feels like, whenever there's a high-profile case involving someone with a mental illness, it just kind of reinforces all this fear and stigma that surrounds the whole topic.
Yeah, I think that's true. And the article makes this really important point about how we need to be careful not to let those, sensationalized headlines kind of dictate how we view, the vast majority of people who live with mental illness every day, Professor Kroeber, one of the experts quoted earlier, he really emphasizes this point. I mean, he's like, look, the vast majority of people with mental illness are not violent. They're not criminals. They're our friends. They're our family members. They're our colleagues.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. We all know someone who struggles with anxiety or depression. Like, it's incredibly common.
Right.
But we don't automatically assume they're going to commit a crime.
Exactly. And yet, when you look at media coverage, it often creates this very distorted picture. And the article actually cites a statistic that really highlights this point. Only about 10% of people with schizophrenia, which, is a condition that's often, kind of unfairly linked to violence, only about 10% of those people ever actually commit violent acts.
That's a really small percentage. So why do we focus so much on, those extreme cases? Like, why does that narrative dominate the conversation?
Well, I think, part of it is because those stories are shocking. They're attention grabbing. They make people afraid. And unfortunately, fear sells.
Right.
But the problem is that this kind of reporting really reinforces stereotypes, and it makes it harder for people to come forward and seek help when they need it.
So it's not just about, getting the facts straight. It's about really changing the whole narrative around mental health.
Hmm.
But how do you do that? Like, how do you combat those deeply ingrained fears and prejudices?
Well, the article suggests a few things. First, it calls for more responsible media coverage.
Yeah.
Reporting that's accurate, that's nuanced, that avoids, sensationalizing these tragedies.
Yeah.
Second, they really emphasize the need for, more education, more awareness campaigns to dispel the myths and promote, understanding of mental illness.
Right.
And finally, they highlight the importance of early intervention and support systems that people can get help before they reach a crisis point.
That makes sense. It's about shifting the focus from, fear and punishment to prevention and support. But I also wonder, are there things that we can do on an individual level? Because it can feel kind of overwhelming to think about tackling this, this huge societal issue.
Yeah, I think every little bit helps. Start by challenging your own assumptions. Educate yourself about mental health. Talk to your friends and family about it. Support organizations that are working to make a difference. And most importantly, just be kind. You never know what someone might be going through.
Yeah, that's a great point. And we've talked a lot about Germany in this deep dive, but this is clearly an issue that goes way beyond any one country.
Absolutely. It's a global challenge, and it's going to require a global response. But I do think there's reason for hope. I mean, we are starting to see a shift in the conversation around mental health. More people are speaking out, more people are sharing their stories and demanding better care. And I think that's a really, really positive sign.
It is. And I'm also thinking about Sven Reiners, that their former hospital director we were talking about earlier. He could have just stayed in his position and kept quiet, but he chose to speak out, even though it meant, leaving his job.
Right.
And that takes courage. To challenge the status quo, especially when it comes to something as complex and as sensitive as this.
It does. And his story is a reminder that change is possible. It's not going to happen overnight, but if we keep pushing for it, we keep having these difficult conversations, if we keep demanding better, we can create a world where mental health is treated with the same urgency and the same compassion as any other health issue.
Well said. Well, this deep dive has been incredibly eye-opening, and I think it's raised some really important questions for all of us to consider. So as we wrap things up here, what's the one thing you hope our listeners will take away from this conversation?
I hope they'll walk away with a greater understanding of just how complex this issue is. It's not about simple solutions or easy answers. It's about recognizing the humanity of every individual who's involved in this and working together to create a more just and a more compassionate system for everyone.
Absolutely. I think that's a perfect note to end on. So thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.